want to trim the canopy. For this, I'm going to be using these scissors that I think the RC car guys use for their polycarbonate bodies. They cut well. I have two of the right trims for some reason, and one of the straight. To help get a better cut line for this canopy, the first thing I've done is I've used a white China marker, and I went around what I believe to be the bottom of the canopy. I really could have helped myself out here a little bit by, as I mentioned, putting some Chart Pack tape, which would have molded in a nice cut line. But since I didn't do that, I used the white marker, and then I placed the canopy over top of that, and then I traced over the white marker with black China marker, which transfers nicely to the plastic. You probably can't see it, but there is a black China marker line I can cut to now. So I'll just keep cutting away with my scissors. Comparing the canopy to the plans, you can see that with the pilot in place, very little clearance to the top of the canopy. I have a lot, so I've got quite a bit more trimming to do. Also, the front should be a little bit flat as it meets the fuselage, and I actually ended up putting a little too much of a curve in it. So I need to remove some of this front so the canopy sits down. Also, you'll notice that the canopy actually sits just below the cutout for the cockpit. I actually have quite a bit, so I need to do quite a bit more trimming. One more thing to mention, the back of the cockpit opening, I don't think mine is quite long enough. I'm going to have to go back in, I believe, retrim the back of my cockpit so that it comes down a little bit more, and then I need to trim off more along the edges as well. You can see that basically the shoulder area of the pilot should be right along the rail, and mine sits a little bit too, my pilot sits a little bit too far down. All right, I've got the canopy fairly well shaped. It's sitting pretty good, and the blue tape, just keep it from moving around right now. One issue that I'm having, let's see, can you see how the cockpit sheeting, how it bows inward a little bit? That happened when I sheeted it. There was no formers inside the cockpit to provide any structure to it, so what typically happens is what happened here is the sheeting bowed inward, and that's going to cause a problem because then when I glue the canopy in, it's going to want to bow inward as well, and I don't think that's going to look very good. So right now I need to work on a way of trying to push this balsa sheeting out a little bit so I don't get this big sinkhole whenever I attach the canopy. Yeah, I just wasn't really happy with the instrument panel. I've never actually seen an instrument panel that slants as much as this one does on any airplane. And I just didn't think that looked right. So yeah, I had to do some surgery. I have printed out an instrument panel from the internet, and it's actually pretty good size. I think it'll work. So I had to go in and cut out the slanted instrument panel. I'm going to have it basically drop straight down like instrument panel should. And so now I'm working, I'm also going to cut out some of the cockpit flooring so that I can have the pilot sit right about like so. And then for the bottom stuff here, I'm probably going to paint that a flat black. What'll be seen painted a flat black, create kind of a shadow. So the cockpit floor, I cut it back. I'm gonna leave this part right here as kind of an aft cockpit decking type thing. I think it'll look all right. When I cut out the floor, I left about 1/4 of an inch of the frame on each side. I think that gives a nice representation of framing on real aircraft. So I'll just leave that like it is. So that brings me up to finally to the canopy fit. Let me put the canopy on so I can show what I'm talking about. The canopy trimmed up really nice, but the one problem that I have that's really driving me crazy is because of how this balsa kind of developed a concave shape when I sheeted it. You can tell from all of this gray putty right here. That's where I tried to fill in some of it, but it just takes far too much putty. So here the canopy fits snug to the fuselage, and here it fits snug, but you can see right here there's a really big gap. And I don't want to push the canopy in and have this big divot or this big concave side, which wouldn't look good at all. So what I intend to do is to add a little bit of a frame. Now, on the real aircraft, or at least the aircraft that have the canopy that slides back, you have these framed, for the canopy rails, for the canopy to slide on. I'm gonna try to build, or I'm building the one where the canopy flips over with piano hinges on the right side. But what I'm gonna do, or what I want to do in my mind's eye, is have 2 frames on each side, and then all this underneath here, I'm going to try to fill in with balsa, multiple pieces of balsa, and then try to sand that balsa flush with the good side of the fuselage. Try to get more of a perpendicular side, and then hopefully with that I can get the canopy glued on, and I think will look better. The cockpit area is now ready to be painted. I'll be painting it white. I'll tell you what I did to get to this point. I applied sanding sealer to all of the raw balsa areas. I applied 4 coats of sanding sealer, and I sanded with the 150 grit sandpaper after each coat. And then after that I applied the automotive primer, sanded it with 220 grit sandpaper, and of course after vacuuming up all the dust, I went over everything with a tack rag to try to get up as much of the smaller dust as I could. So all this will be getting painted white. I haven't put the instrument panel in yet. After I paint the cockpit, then I'll go in and install this instrument panel. For the paint, I'm using an artist acrylic paint. It's a pretty thick gel in the container, so I thin it with a mix of 75% alcohol and tap water, well not tap water, distilled water, and a few drops of liquid soap. And I put it in a jar, shake it up. It does fairly well this way. It's a nice paint. It's water-based, so it makes cleanup real easy. For spraying, I'm using an Iwata HPM2. It's a medium tip. I'm using this because it's the smallest airbrush I have, and it should be sort of easy to get in. The hose is going to be the problem. I think the insides and the bottom will be okay, but I'm going to have probably a little bit of an issue on the sides here. I'll see how well I can do. I'm using 25 psi pressure, and I used to have a glass plate for testing my spraying, but I can't seem to find it, so I'm just using a glass jar. And that seems to be a pretty good pattern right there. It's going to be fairly thin. It's going to take multiple coats. So let's get going. I had my GoPro set up on a headband, and even though I tested it a few times, I still managed to not get the right angle. So most of the painting is out of frame on the video. So I'll just give you a few quick snippets. I'm going to call painting of the cockpit complete. Previously I had added flat black to the wing. See, the wing is back on. I added flat black to the wing, and I just painted the servo support flat black as well. It gives kind of a shadow effect, trying to get the idea that it just kind of fades away. So now it's time to install the instrument panel. All right, I've got an instrument panel. It's a pretty basic affair. It's just a picture that I downloaded from the internet, pasted onto some balsa. So, talking about the picture a little bit, I did a lot of searching on the internet for the right picture of an instrument panel that had this very shallow curve along the top, and it would kind of fill out the sides of the former. I tried to find actually one for a DR-107 one design, but I wasn't really successful there. So I found another website that this company, I think, makes instrument panels for light sport aircraft, and this is one of their gallery examples. And it pretty much fit the bill pretty well. It's got that nice shallow curve along the top. It almost fills out the edge of the balsa. So that worked out pretty good, and then the bottom is a little bit short, but I actually lengthened this bottom down here so that it would blend in with the servo cross support. And so that's why I did. I could have shortened this, but I elected to leave it like this. And so yeah, I just took traced out the former F3 from the plans, and then cut out this balsa piece. It's 2mm balsa. And before I did anything with that balsa, after I cut it out, I hit it with a spray sealer. Yes, this is a spray sealer, but other than that, I have no idea what kind of sealer. But it does seem to work. It's not as good as a wood-specific sanding sealer. Like this is a wood-based, water-based wood sanding sealer. This stuff has a high solids content. It does a really nice job. I think you've seen how I've used it on the cockpit to fill the grain. But I didn't do that with the instrument panel. I just used this to basically stop any kind of warping. And you can probably see, yeah, you can see a little bit of grain there. But I'm not going to sweat that because this part sits up underneath the fuselage and you really can't see it. Alright, so it was a couple of coats of this spray sealer and sanded, and then I just went straight to a black paint. I painted this face black, and that was one reason. I used a acrylic black, artist acrylic black for that, and that's one reason why I used the spray sealer, to keep that water-based paint from warping this wood. See, it did a pretty good job. It's got a very slight warp in it, minimal, and those will be easily taken care of when I glue it inside the fuselage. So after I painted it black, then I printed out my instrument panel. Now I tried using an instrument panel or printing it out on a piece of glossy photo paper. I don't know if you can tell, that just turned out really very poorly. Very poorly. I don't know what happened. Now the instructions on the packaging of this paper said it's good for a year. I didn't know that stuff had a shelf life to it, but maybe that's what happened. So what I did is I just printed this out on regular old plain paper. Now I'm going to try to superimpose an image here to show you how it's a little bit washed out. The image is kind of lightened, if you will. So after and so then I went ahead and glued that paper on with just some 3M Super 77 spray adhesive. I just sprayed, I think it's about 2 or 3 coats on the back of the instrument panel paper, and then placed it onto the wood, smoothed it down, and that all worked really well. And then after that dried, then I went over the whole thing with a couple of coats, actually about 5 or 6 coats of this acrylic top coat gloss, and you have to take my word for it, that's what it is. Comparing this to the plain paper before I did anything to it, you can see how this top coat, it actually enriches the colors. It makes the black, the surrounding black, you know, darker, and it makes the colors in the glass panels kind of pop a little bit. So that works out pretty good. I like that. I didn't really want the whole thing to be glossy, but I didn't really want to take the time to mask off the black just to get gloss in the glass panels. And it's okay. I like it. I think at the right angle, I mean, you wouldn't even know that it's glossy. The instrument panel was glued to former F3 using thick CA. I think this instrument panel looks a lot better in the vertical orientation as opposed to the slanted orientation that was shown on the plans. And I think overall for this model, this panel is going to look pretty nice. In the next episode, we continue with the cockpit by adding the side rails and filling in the concavity below the side rail so that the canopy fits better against the fuselage.